But hello and welcome to the 60th meeting of the Strand Group. How amazing it is, what a great honour it is for me to welcome you to that. And to King's College London, friends new and friends old. My name's Dr. Jack Brown. I'll be chairing tonight's proceedings. I'm particularly pleased to be here this evening, not only because it is the 60th Strand Group meeting, but also because I hope that this will be part of a regular series of London-focused events as part of our programme going into the future. And a particularly warm welcome and great thanks are due to our new sponsors for this London-focused event. The North Bank bid, I'm going to get out of the way of these beautiful banners. North Bank bid and the Central District Alliance, without whom, and this is a cliche but it is true, tonight would not be possible. We are delighted to work in partnership with both organisations in our shared interest of exploring the most important issues facing London, London's past, London's present, but also London's future. We have an excellent speaker this evening. Professor Tony Travers is, look away Tony, in my view, the greatest authority on London in the country. That was totally organic.
Thank you, Jack.
I didn't put them up to that or anything.
Thank you, Jack.
And therefore in the world, I guess, right? Okay, so I've gone too far. He may be employed, and this is an important point, he's employed by our great rivals, the London School of Economics. I did pause for boos there. The boos were not major because actually the LSE are our great friends, of course, and Professor Travers is an extremely collegiate and collaborative academic. He even regularly guest lectures on my master's module on the history and governance of London, which is something that...
And very good it is too, the module. I mean.
There you go. A lot of mutual back scratching to start. But wonderful, wonderful. He manages to do a history of London from the Romans to Boris Johnson in 45 minutes. So since he's been doing that, I've been noticing he has an ability to fit an incredible amount of information in a very engaging way into a short period of time. And I've been trying to get him to do this lecture. I look back over my emails since 2019. Now, there was a pandemic that intervened, but there's obviously a little bit of a gap there that I have to just sort of hold my hands up to and say it's my fault. But I'm delighted that we've got here tonight. Professor Travers is going to speak for about 40 minutes-ish? 35, yeah. 35 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. We've got a really great audience, lots of people with great expertise, so I'm looking forward very much to those questions. And that is essentially me done. For now, I would like to hand over to the academic that I'd like to be when I grow up, Professor Tony Travers.
Thank you, Jack. Well, what can I say? Thank you very much, Jack, for that over-generous introduction. Just before I begin, I'd like to pay tribute to my friends and colleagues at King's for not only for arranging this evening, but also the Strand Group. It's a brilliant enterprise to bring together people from central and local government in the UK and to help us think about British politics more generally. And also worth saying a word about Professor Ken Young, of course, who was here at King's, who worked at the LSE before that, studied London, particularly the government and politics of London, for a number of decades before coming to King's to study, I think it was war studies and deterrence. So there's an interesting career switch later in life. But still, anyway, what I want to do this evening is to talk about London at a crossroads. I'm afraid the word crossroads will become slightly laboured. I'm going to return to it more than once. When you've got a title like this, you have to do that. But what I want to do is look at the city's government, economy and its place within the UK. These are issues of interest obviously to everybody in this room. So nice to see so many of you here tonight. But also, they have a resonance in other cities, major cities around the world, and of course in other cities in the United Kingdom. So I'm going to begin by just talking briefly. I've got one or two pictures I'll put up when the time comes, but not too many. So as everybody in the room will well know, the story of London's 2,000-year history is well documented in hundreds of books on the subject. From the arrival of the Romans to the arrival of artificial intelligence, the city has grown from Londinium via Londonwick to London. A small settlement at Cornhill, not far away to the east from here, has expanded to a 600 square mile city of Greater London, 9 million people. The even wider London region, and I'm going to talk a bit about that later on, 15,000 square miles, is today home to about 24 million people, and it's one of the 4 largest city regional economies in the world. There have been good times and bad times over the period since the city was settled by the Romans. What I want to do initially this evening is to explore some of the periods and events when people would have wondered about the city's capacity to survive and to thrive. Going back as far as the end of Roman London in 410, it's remembering that their departure led to a 200-year period of abandonment where the city was, in fact, no history written down about it really, with the Saxons then locating their new city of Londonwick. There's a coffee shop on the Aldwych which takes that name. A reminder that, of course, Saxon London was here, on this very site where we are today, at the Aldwych. But, of course, eventually the Saxons moved their city back to within the safety of the Roman city walls. And the name Aldwych, of course, is even today a reminder of this history. It has its origins in Saxon London. During the first half of the 11th century, Saxon King Edward the Confessor established his base upriver from Londonwick at today's Westminster, thus locating political and religious power outside what was at that time London. And this separation between political Westminster and commercial London is still with us today and affects many aspects of the city and indeed the country's understanding of itself ever since. This is going to be a bit of fast-forward history. King William of Normandy arrived in England and indeed London in 1066, and he created a dynamic fusion of Saxon and Norman cultures, and amongst other things, granted the City of London a charter. So my first picture tonight, if we can get it up. Oh, it's not working now. Try to the clicker. Sorry about this. Ah, Jack.
Click.
Ah, there we are. So our first fascinating visual this evening is of the City of London. The City of London still owns this document at the Guildhall, the original charter granted in 1067. According to Simon Jenkins, at this point London became a state within a state. It had this specific status. I'll return to this observation later, but this, the granting of a charter, was clearly a crossroads moment for the city and its people. Roll forward a couple of centuries, Caroline Barron, the historian, observed in her book, London in the Later Middle Ages, that London's fortunes varied because of poverty, plague, and the threat of insurrection. So she wrote, in the 16th century, London faced massive problems caused by rapid population growth, poverty, shortage of work, endemic plague, threatened famine, and religious controversy, all to some degree still with us today. In these circumstances, with an eye to urban disorder in continental towns, the Tudor monarchs and their councillors feared the worst, but to the surprise of all, stability was maintained. There were many reasons for this, she writes, but in part it was due to the maturity of those who governed the city and had come to realise that to govern London was a responsibility and a duty, and not simply a golden opportunity for personal gain. Perhaps the worst ever threat to London was the twinning of the Great Plague in 1665 and 66 and the Great Fire in 1666. The outbreak of plague was the most lethal since 1348, with over 7,000 Londoners dying per week at its peak. The king left for the safety of Hampton Court. Parliament and the courts moved to Oxford. Thousands of the city's better-off inhabitants fled to their country homes. Does this sound familiar? recent times. The 1666 Great Fire destroyed a significant proportion of the city's housing and businesses, most churches, including the original St Paul's Cathedral, and many livery halls. The need to respond to the twin disasters of plague and fire most certainly left London at a crossroads. According to Peter Ackroyd in his biography of London, the impact was profound, and he says, many of those who lived in the city before the fire did not return to the scene of devastation. Some migrated to country districts. Others travelled to the United States. But once the rebuilding of the city began, thousands of new people were drawn into its orbit. Hundreds of hawkers and traders moved into the city, which had lost half of its markets and most of its shops. And there, of course, came the builders who took advantage of the situation to run up whole streets of houses. So again, the sense of something we all recognise in modern times. And of course, most famously, Charles II commissioned Sir Christopher Wren to design and construct dozens of new churches and today's St Paul's Cathedral. The city recovered, prospered and sprawled out into the fields of Covent Garden, St Giles and eventually as far as distant Marylebone. By the 19th century, pollution generated, and this is a rapid run through history, pollution generated by coal burning and noxious industries increased as London grew to become what was called the greatest city the world had ever known, its population passing 1 million in around 1800. The city's notoriously fragmented government made it difficult to build clean water supplies or sewers, and making cholera a regular visitor. Parliament eventually imposed a Metropolitan Board of Works, which built the embankment, of course, and then the London County Council to improve the capital's infrastructure. It took social reformers such as Henry Mayhew, the Earl of Shaftesbury, Charles Dickens, most famously, to highlight the dismal conditions of the poor in London and thus to promote legislation to improve their conditions. It's worth noting that Tower Hamlets, which is the city's most densely populated borough today, which has a population of 320,000 people, had a population of 600,000 at the beginning of the 20th century, many living in, well, I say indescribable squalor. In fact, lots of historians wrote about it in really gut-churning detail. It was dismally squalid. 20th century brought a major outbreak of influenza in 2018, the nearest thing of its kind before the pandemic. Little written about, interesting, not much of a literature about that influenza pandemic, partly because government didn't have many weapons to cope with it. Then, of course, the Blitz in the early 1940s. Having said that, between 1918 and 1939, not only did London grow enormously out onto the fields of Middlesex and Surrey and Kent, but London Transport was created by Lord Ashfield and Frank Pick to create the world's exemplar public transport system. Housing was plentiful and cheap. And again, it's impossible if you look at adverts for housing at the time. Houses in Middlesex cost sort of £350 for a semi-detached house. Anybody could have afforded one. There wasn't a housing crisis, at least not for the growing middle class of the kind we know today. So fast did the city grow out that in the late 1930s a green belt was imposed to stop what was thought to be endless sprawl. It's worth thinking today, because without it, London and Birmingham would presumably have grown together into a single vast city today in the way Tokyo and Yokohama have. Now, the destruction wrought by the Blitz, which was profound, anybody who looks at Ealing films made in the late 1940s can see this, created the need for housing and commercial property reconstruction of a parallel kind of what happened after the Great Fire. But despite this post-war reconstruction, London then suffered 3 decades of economic and population decline. Though it may not have been entirely apparent at the time, London in 1945 was also at a crossroads. Global economic change, which affected not only London but affected it earlier in many ways, led to a major decline in London's manufacturing industry. The docks and the population also declined in the 50s and 60s and 70s. This was made worse by policies such as, the more mature of you will remember, George Brown, not Gordon, but George Brown's office ban, which actually stopped all office building in central London. And by 1977, the urbanist Sir Peter Hall, the famous urbanist Sir Peter Hall, was able to write in his preface for a book which was ominously entitled London the Heartless City, And I quote, "This book is not comfortable to read. Anybody expecting uplift or optimism should stop here. It shows London as it is. At the beginning of the last quarter of the 20th century, it depicts a city that, contrary to the popular vision of many, is actually in a state of decline. It chronicles a sad story of muddle and indecision and delay on the part of those responsible for London's government. It suggests strongly that many key policies still in operation may be positively perverse in that they are doing London and Londoners actual injury." So that's what Sir Peter Hall wrote for Thames Television, a book Thames Television produced in 1977. And assuming this will move on this time, this is a Don McCullum image. Many people in the room will remember London looking a bit like this. I know it's in black and white, and I chose the images from this time. This is Spitalfields. If you go there today, it's a remarkably, it's almost impossible to imagine how much this area has changed. But lots of London looked a bit like this as recently, actually this one is 1984, this photograph. It's even more recent than that Peter Hall observation. But Hall's observations were bleak by any standards, and that the fact that the abolition of the Greater London Council then came along in 1986, and that coincided with the city's population reaching a post-war low of 6.6 million, 8.6 to 6.6 million in a relatively short time, and with every expectation the population would fall further. Deindustrialization had created mile upon mile of derelict land, notably where the world's largest docks had been. The film The Long Good Friday will tell you more about this than you ever need to learn from history books. There appeared to be no crossroads at this point. I'm labouring the crossroads point. Simply a road heading towards oblivion. But population unexpectedly started to grow after the mid-1980s, and by 2000, population growth was accelerating, so that 15 or so years on from the city's post-war nadir, London Docklands was towering upwards. So here we've got the image of Docklands, and by the way, Jack wrote the definitive study of this. His PhD is on this subject. So from that position, the picture of the Docklands over there, to this, between 1987 and 2000. And if we just move on to what it looks like today, just shows you how easy it is for things to change one way, let's hope it's only one way, in such a very short time. So what we've seen since then is the Docklands was towering upwards. The City of London had reversed its anti-development policy, because the City of London before Docklands was really quite unenthusiastic about development, very different to today. The Docklands Light Railway was built, and the Jubilee Line extension had opened, and it opened up inner East London. Crossrail was being planned. Another unsung hero was actually Paul Shannon, as a transport minister, who commissioned the Central London Rail Study, which had a profound impact on everything that's happened to transport since. Millennium-themed projects have been completed at Tate Modern, the British Museum, North Greenwich, that's the Dome, and the famous Millennium Bridge. So in 2000, London's first directly elected mayor took office in addition to all of this, and as if by a miracle, the population started to rise quickly again. Subsequently, St Pancras and King's Cross have been spectacularly regenerated. Shoreditch, Hackney, inner East London, inner South East London have become expensively cool. Even Walthamstow, I don't know who lives in Walthamstow, is now fashionable. Battersea and Nine Elms have sprouted a forest of towers, while Battersea Power Station was finally built with its own spur onto the underground after 3 failed attempts before that. The 2012 Olympics rapidly transformed Stratford and Hackney Wick, and are still doing so, much more still going on there. And elsewhere, Paddington, Surrey Quays, North Acton, Wembley. This is modern Wembley, near the stadium. Where I got to on this list, Wembley. Harrow Town Centre. This is what Harrow Town Centre looks like. These are outer London boroughs with their own mini clusters of towers. Colindale, Lewisham Town Centre, Ilford, Southall, Hazen, Harlington, Barking Town Centre, Barking, Riverside, Sutton Town Centre, Ponders End, and more complicatedly, Croydon. have seen major redevelopments, often creating their own mini clusters, as I've shown of downtown-type towers. The optimistically named Thameslink 2000 project was eventually completed in 2020. Last year, the Elizabeth line opened to huge acclaim. The Elizabeth line, that is already the most heavily used railway in the United Kingdom. Where Thameslink and the Elizabeth line and 3 tube lines meet at Farringdon is surely London's equivalent to Paris's remarkable rail interchange at Châtelet-les-Halles. So, London moved from, in Peter Hall's words, a city that is actually in a state of decline in 1977 to what is often portrayed as the world's leading global city by the mid-2000s. So this is the kind of image that you can see. Jason Hawkes takes these marvellous photographs all the time. In effect, from Ken Loach's world to Richard Curtis's in one relatively short step. No one has researched, even if it were possible, precisely why this happened. Events in the explanation, and many of you in the room who come to the Strand Group will have thought about these things in other circumstances. The progressive social changes made by the Labour government, Roy Jenkins in particular, in the late 1960s. Margaret Thatcher's deregulation of the economy and its big bang liberation of the financial services industry in the 1980s. The major government's decisions about Millennium Project, new transport, cultural and public realm investments in London during the early 1990s, and the post-1997 Labour government spending on the underground, PPP for the underground, not good. But the money that was then ploughed in has made a radical difference. Commuter railways as well, railway stations, enormous improvement to railway stations, mainline stations in London, including St Pancras, which must be one of the wonders of the world in railway architecture terms. And then, of course, the 2012 Olympics and the creation of the GLA and particularly the Office of Mayor that I mentioned earlier. For those of you, again, with a longer memory of this stuff, going back to the London Planning Advisory Committee, LPAC, which was a committee set up to look at planning borough-wide, all the boroughs were members after 1986, produced a study called London World City, which was published in 1991. It was a key encapsulation of a major change in direction and a new ambition for the city, definitely ahead of its time. So London today has a massive inheritance of what are both soft and hard attributes, notably the scale of its arts, creative and cultural institutions, its universities, its legal system, its position as a media hub, its architecture, its history, its airport system, its retail and tourism industries, its incredibly extensive public transport system, and of course, its language. I should actually say languages these days. Together with a globally powerful pull factor, these things together create a globally powerful pull factor for the footloose people and investment, which together now determine how the global economy develops. And American academics such as Richard Florida and Ed Glazer have written extensively about the ecosystem of inherited benefits which cities such as London, New York and Paris combine, giving them a fortuitous attractiveness, not to say permanence, as compared to smaller and or newer cities. So to summarise where I've got so far, I've made the case that London has long been subject to huge setbacks and even apparent catastrophes, and yet has survived and continued to grow. It's not unique in this way. Other cities have faced the same kind of thing, but it is worth noting about this city. And it's grown both economically and in terms of its population. Now I want to look ahead at what may well be seen as another crossroads, because there has been recent turbulence, to put it mildly. Now, London, in common with the rest of the United Kingdom, has experienced 4 once-in-a-lifetime shocks within half a generation. So the 2008 banking and finance crisis, the 2016 Brexit vote and its consequences, 2020 to 22 COVID-19 pandemic, and Vladimir Putin's 2022 invasion of Ukraine all created what are optimistically called economic headwinds for London and for the country as a whole. Much worse, of course, for the people of Ukraine. Of course, 3 of the 4 shocks affected most cities and countries in the world, whilst Brexit has had consequences for the EU 27 as well as for Britain. if we just take them in order, the 2008 banking crisis was widely expected to cause terrible harm to London's economy, largely because financial and business services were perceived to be such a major part of the city's growth and productivity. In the event, we now know, government bailouts largely protected the banking sector, though it's apparent that both London and the UK's economic growth and productivity have been reduced by that shock. And that shock has reduced trend growth in the UK from 2.5% to 1 or 1.5%, something Liz Truss had noticed, but perhaps went off in the wrong direction. Brexit is work in progress. Indeed, it looks as if it will be for decades to come. It's a helpful cliche, it was said of devolution. It's a process and not an event. The number of financial services jobs relocated to the EU has been significantly lower than initially predicted, although there may be something of a slow puncture effect, which means we do not yet fully know what the city and its industries will eventually, or how they will eventually be affected. It's also clear that insofar as well-paid jobs and GDP have moved to other EU cities, they have done so in a fragmented way, some to Amsterdam, some to Berlin, some to Paris, some even to Milan. The City of London remains the largest financial centre in Europe. Having said this, the government has been so preoccupied since 2016, I think it's fair to say that few of the imagined Brexit freedoms have been delivered. Although the recent Windsor framework may be the start of a resettling of UK-EU relations. Evidence from official statisticians is very clear, points to the real possibility that other parts of the United Kingdom, particularly those where manufacturing, agriculture and fisheries are based, will face, where they're a bigger share of the economy, they may be suffering a bigger Brexit-induced economic impact than London, because London continues to record the highest regional growth in the country. Paradox indeed. Second-order consequence of Brexit, of course, was the government's levelling up agenda and policy. The vote for Brexit was interpreted, at least in part, as a signal from parts of the UK with lower GDP per head and where people were deemed to have been left behind, that they resented London's success and affluence, and Jack has written extensively about this. However energetically ministers attempted to reassure London politicians that levelling up was not an anti-London policy, there were plenty of signals that that is precisely what it was. Decisions effectively to kill off proposals for Crossrail 2, explicit Arts Council policies to reduce funding in London, notably the totemic English National Opera decision, and pots of cash such as the Towns Fund, where London boroughs were not allowed to bid for it, made it clear that levelling up could, at least in certain circumstances, mean levelling down. However, I think it's fair to say the levelling up policy, despite Michael Gove, who I have some time for, has been erratic in its implementation and it's unlikely that initiatives adopted thus far will be sufficient to achieve a longer-term improvement in the life chances and productivity of people and places deemed to have been left behind. The deindustrialisation, which led to the unarguable problems facing many smaller towns in the Midlands and the north of England, would take a generation of consensus policy to solve, not a 4-year parliament. COVID-19 affected, and is still affecting, another of my fascinating visuals. Here's a picture of Oxford Street in June 2020. Any of you who were here at the time will remember in your own neighbourhoods what it was like. Now, COVID-19 affected and is still affecting central London more than any other part of the country. City downtowns were much more affected than other parts of this city and other cities. Lockdowns reduced underground traffic by 95% early in the pandemic, and of course that figure is still not anywhere near fully recovered, leaving a great big gap in TfL's income. A steep decline in commuting and business travel more generally have posed questions about the future of London's central activities zone, this incredibly productive central area we're in at the moment, as well as leaving TfL's finances in a parlous condition. There has been much debate and many consultancy reports about the longer-term impact of the pandemic on London and on other cities' centres. But it increasingly looks as if the dynamic effects of being at the centre of a region of 24 million people are, step by step, taking the city's central area back towards its previously hyper-productive position. Certainly at the weekends it's like that. People have proved a bit more willing to go back in the weekends than in the week. And then last but not least, Mr. Putin's adventurism will have short-term effects on the UK and London economy, as it will affect other European countries and cities, and indeed beyond Europe. In some ways, and notwithstanding last autumn's governmental meltdown, London still looks a relatively safe haven for capital investment, given its semi-detached position on the far west of Europe. The city's government. Now, against the backdrop of the last 14 years, it's easy to argue that London is at one of these periodic crossroads that are in this title, and that the city's government at all three levels has the power to make decisions shaping the city's future. To use a more sort of cliche term, government has agency to. It can either just leave things as they are, or it can intervene to bring about change. It's interesting to note that one of the national rail companies has started to play around with fares, reducing fares on a Monday to try to get people back to travel not only Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. And government, as well as private companies, will be thinking about these things. Central government controls much of the investment the city needs, and I think it's fair to say there's a risk that the levelling up policy starves London of the new infrastructure it needs. There's also a threat to the quality of maintenance on the railways, social housing, that's not new, and the NHS estate. Some of the hospitals in London, and not only in London, need a great deal of investment. Whitehall has recently increasingly intervened in planning and transport governance as well, not always in a constructive way, that is stepping in to override the mayor and all the boroughs. Now, the Greater London Authority, and I'm going to mention now, we're talking about this boundary, which has proved incredibly resilient, drawn by the or actually by the government after the Herbert Commission in the early 1960s. This boundary has proved incredibly resilient. The Greater London Authority, which has already outlived the Greater London Council's lifespan by 2 years, which is going some, clearly needs additional devolved powers. Britain's the most centralised large democracy or certainly England within Britain, within the United Kingdom, in the world. Indeed, all city regional governments in England require substantive further devolution. Conservative Mayor Andy Street in Birmingham, West Midlands, Andy Birmingham in Greater Manchester, Andy Haldane, a lot of Andys here, chair of the Levelling Up Advisory Council and head of the RSA down the road, and academics such as Paul Collier and both Boris Johnson and Sadiq Khan as mayors of London have strongly argued for greater devolution in hyper-centralised England. With more powers should come a rebalancing, of course, between the mayor and the Assembly. The mayor would gain more executive responsibility, but the Assembly's quasi-legislative role would need enhancing if there were substantive further devolution. Remarkably, the boroughs, shown here, are 58 years old, which in the standards of subnational government in Britain is a very long time. The city, of course, in the middle is nearly 1,000 years old. And I think the latter's 1,000th anniversary will occur in 2067. Jack certainly will be writing about that then. If King, he said slightly portentously, if King William's Charter is to be a guide. And the current balance of power between London councils and the mayor is an accidental creation. London's government is, and this is a cliche too, a bottom-heavy two-tier system, where neighbourhood and metropolitan interests are negotiated and mediated. Now, whatever you think about the current struggle over the extension of the ULEZ, it allows local and citywide interests to be argued about. You have a view on which side you're on, but we need to have a way of having these debates. There are from time to time suggestions that 33 councils is too large a number. And looking for some of these images, you find some there's some brilliant websites, On London is here represented out there, brilliant ones where people have come up with 5 boroughs. I think Ken Livingstone first had this idea, and the names that they'd give them. Look online, they're great potential names. But given that the borough with the smallest population following the census, Kensington and Chelsea, has a population similar to Middlesbrough, that's not a comparison you're going to hear very often between Kensington, Chelsea and Middlesbrough, and that several of the larger boroughs, including Croydon and Barnet, each have a population bigger than Leicester, these are already big cities in their own right. And of course, add to that, reorganisation in Britain is almost always a way of giving the impression that a policy problem is being solved when generally there's no evidence of a link between reorganisation and solving whatever the problem is. Now, as I mentioned earlier, London sits within a city region of about 24 million people, consisting of London itself, 9 million, the South East, 9.3 million, and the East of England, 6.3 million. So here we have the wider southeast. Even just beyond this area lie major towns such as Bournemouth and Swindon, which are within London's economic orbit. And some of the furthest flung places in this area on the screen here are Kings Lynn and Banbury, or Bournemouth, which is just outside. These are all places which are an hour and a half or so on a train from central London. Birmingham, of course, is currently an hour and 19 minutes, much closer. And of course, huge amounts of money are spent to try to move it closer still. But in fact, the journey from Birmingham to Euston today is the same distance in time as from Gants Hill to West Ruislip on the Central Line inside Greater London. And I think this map, which is the south, this is the Southeast Rail map, tells us a great deal about the interconnectedness of the Southeast. Not sure I travel on many of these South Coast lines much because they're rather slow, but the feeding in and out of central London is a real phenomenon. If you look at academic work on how people commute around this area, you can see this is a mega city region by any standards. So London's population has increased from 8.6 million in 1939 to 9 million today, albeit via a low point of 6.6 million in 1985. But after 1985, it increased quickly, and particularly quickly between 2000 and 2020. The United Kingdom's population in this same period grew up from 47 to 67 million people. And if we look at the shorter period since the 1960s, the wider southeast has grown from a population of about 17.6 million to 24.4 million. That's between 1961 and 2020. And the GDP of this region, I've just taken away from you, that region, is about £1.2 trillion. That's the GDP of this area, just over 47% of the UK total. That means that in this area, almost half the UK's GDP is created in 16% of its area, very ecologically sound. This is the same GDP as Spain's, but in 3% of the land mass. Now note that the increase in the wider southeast between 1961 and 2020 is almost 6 million. And it's easy to see how professional planners have long hoped for some, misguidedly it turns out, for some form of governance for this inexorably going sphere of London. Because despite the green belt, the city's region is growing fast. House building has occurred at the edges of many towns in the south east and east regions, creating new sprawl, not on the immediate edge of London, but mostly outside the green belt. Local authorities just outside London, the London boundary, are growing faster than those inside it, and the areas further out, but within this city region, are growing faster still. London, which has always been an amorphous concept, is growing out. Something very similar can be seen in the New York and Paris regions, with far greater growth since 1945 in the outer part of their regions than within the core of the city itself. So here is a hard-to-read chart, but I'm sure all these slides can be made available later. And I've just highlighted one thing with a large red arrow, which is, if you look at the population of the wider southeast minus London, it's increased by nearly 6 million between 1961 and today. That's 6 Birminghams have been added to that large, apparently rural east and southeast area just beyond the London boundary, and saying the further you go out, the more it grows faster. So this relentless growth surely goes some way to explain London's capacity to change and regenerate. Peter Hall wrote extensively about this phenomenon as well. There is in effect a dynamo effect, attracting new talent, investment and business to the wider southeast, some from the rest of the UK, sometimes resented, thus allowing London and its interconnected region to be globally attractive by facilitating a kind of division of labour, but not only labour, between very different, closely located areas. Very different places, but with a fascinating interconnectedness. So, I'm coming to the end now. Am I optimistic or pessimistic looking ahead? Well, history and the trends briefly outlined above describe a longer-term resilience which has allowed London to become a global megacity. This has happened, to recall the title of Michael Hebbert's excellent book about the city, quote, more by fortune than design. The fact that London had been allowed to grow to such a large size before the Green Belt was imposed has left a very large area within the Green Belt, that's just Greater London really, to develop and redevelop. And contemporary anti-sprawl, pro-density policy means that the arguments for further population growth within the existing boundaries of London could take the population up well above 10 million. If it only went to 10.5 million, it would be at the density of Ealing, leafy Ealing. Leafy with one or two towers these days, but leafy nevertheless. And if it was built at the densities of Tower Hamlets or Islington, that would reach a population in Greater London of 24 million. And Paris, Haussmann in Paris, 35 million. So I'm not saying it should do that, obviously. I'm just making the point that there's quite a lot of space for densification, even without high-rises, within the 600 square miles of Greater London. Moreover, London's population is diverse in multi-dimensional ways. Its population is now significantly more overseas born, think about this, than New York City's. 43%, according to the census, of the residential population of London today were born outside the UK, compared with 36% in the recent census in New York, looking at Americans in New York. As a mixture of communities, neighbourhoods and cultures, it has few parallels anywhere. The resilience, scale, diversity and economic power of London, and indeed of this wider southeast area, mean there are good grounds for optimism about the medium term. Most of the city's advantages remain in place, and the wider literature about global cities confirms their likely continued growth and success, which is not to say second-scale cities and new cities are not going to grow. It's just that there's a lot in this city that suggests it's got a future. Now, it would be naive to ignore the impacts of Brexit in its current incomplete form. But Brexit will eventually be sorted out. What we do not yet know is how long this will take. Similarly, the fallout from the pandemic and the impact of working from home on the city centre's remarkable ecosystem has yet to be fully understood. The impact on productivity, I would argue, is unlikely to be helpful. Research has suggested that London may be losing out to Paris in terms of inward investment. This is research from the London Property Alliance. And again, it may also take several years to understand the impact of this more fully. But more positively, it's evident that investment in tech industries, property and medical research remain far higher in London than many European cities. International tourism is also recovering. But nothing can be taken for granted. Cities have waned as well as waxed. Government at the borough, citywide and national level have the capacity to direct this future and to deliver policy outcomes. Economic growth, consistent investment, the quality of the environment and good government would all contribute to the city's future. And just coming to the very end, what kind of policy changes would I personally suggest might be required to achieve success? And I would argue that action is required in a number of sectors. First, I would say this, devolution of greater power to the GLA and the boroughs. Devolution in England has been a convoluted and half-hearted policy. London, having been given an initial and successful version of English devolution, has more recently been subjected to at least some retreat and more intervention by central government. As I said earlier, ministers now routinely override the boroughs or the mayor on planning decisions. even to the point of stopping new housing being built on a station car park. The pandemic was used to justify interventions in London's transport system of a kind not visited on the National Railway, despite the latter being a far worse performer than the Tube and the Underground. So I think the time has come to deliver a far greater degree of devolution both to City Hall and Town Halls. This will require, point 2, secure and predictable long-term tax sources to underpin investment. The London Finance Commission, which reported 10 years ago, I chaired it, I have to admit, advocated giving London control over a full range of property taxes plus the possibility of a tourist tax and other smaller revenues. Other city regions could benefit similarly along these lines themselves. Third, continued investment in public transport. We can't go into a start, stop pattern that's been characterised London over certainly since 1945. Actually, not only investment in public transport, also in housing and in the NHS estate, as I said earlier, including, in my personal view, the transfer of all commuter railways to TfL control. Anybody who uses South London stations, compare them with any tube station, it's a difference of light years. The debate about levelling up has left ministers feeling they should not be seen to invest in London. Such a policy would be inequitable. Lots of very poor people live in London, and would reduce the Treasury's tax take. There are good reasons for investing in London's physical capital. Next, the bus service. Cities' ridership numbers have been declined since well before the pandemic, partly because of central government policy towards TfL's finances, but partly because of the chaos of undermanaged roadworks, which have significantly reduced speeds and reduce them to a crawl in many parts of the city. Despite all the measures that have been put, congestion charge, bus priority measures, road speeds are no faster than they were 30 years ago. An increase in house building. Recent steep rise in private rents and also the large number of people stuck in temporary accommodation, made more challenging still by the government's use of local hotels and hostels to house asylum seekers for long periods, make it, to me, axiomatic that there should be a major uptick in private and public house building. Moreover, and I think the increase in rents is a real threat. If younger people feel they can't move to London and get a job, what would threaten London's flexibility and creativity more? So there will be no aids will need to be found to ensure that new social housing can be provided, but with the ongoing maintenance resources to sustain it at high quality, something that social housing in Britain has never got right. Next, radical improvements to clean and safe policies to ensure all Londoners feel safe and proud of their communities. Recent research done by UK and a Changing Europe, housed at King's College, showed that if you asked people what they wanted from levelling up, it was to feel safe in the streets around their own home, for streets to be clean and safe to use at night, but actually during the day as well. After 13 years of austerity, many streets and neighbourhoods are blighted by poor levels of basic service provision, and it appears the state is in retreat. Nearly done. A rational migration policy, not just for London, but for the United Kingdom. Say no more about that. Serious issue, nothing to do with recent events. Better accountability for the Metropolitan Police. The current arrangements for governing London's police are a complete muddle. The Metropolitan Police have both London and national responsibilities, including diplomatic and counter-terrorism duties. The Home Secretary, in the name of the monarch, appoints the Commissioner, albeit having consulted the Mayor, while the Mayor determines budgets and non-operational policy. The Commissioner alone determines operational policy. No wonder everyone can blame everyone else when something goes wrong. Two final points. Central London. The complexity of the boundaries and institutional control of the city centre, given its importance to the London and UK economy, do create a challenge for the central boroughs, of which there are 10, City Hall, TfL, the Metropolitan Police, and the two other police forces operating in this area, business improvements, districts, and other institutions such as the Royal Park, who have to work together to achieve powerful and effective interventions which are necessary to maintain and develop this globally recognised area. Policies such as tall buildings, utilities, open spaces, major events could be made more consistent and produce better outcomes for businesses and residents. Central London would do a great job, and I'm definitely not suggesting a reorganisation, but I do think this is an area, literally an area, that needs thought. And last but not least, improve the understanding of London within the United Kingdom. Some of the policies that have been adopted recently do stem from a sense outside London that everybody in London's rich, or that there are no poor people in London anymore, neither of which, of course, are true. And attitudes to London are often badly out of line with reality. London has among the worst concentrations of deprivation in the United Kingdom, certainly in the smallest area. And the confusion as London as a synonym for the failures of central government, with London as a place of residence and work, is seriously problematic. Others would have different policy ideas, but these are intended to be a mixture of the more constitutional and longer-term ones, along with more immediate needs for policy action. Some of them require central government action, others more local attention. Further possible topics for attention could include post-school, non-university education, always in need of attention, under-5s provision, ditto, and amending the planning system to help deliver net zero policies, not least of which because lots of London is old housing, and only one borough, I think, so far, Kensington and Chelsea, has taken steps to try to square off the needs to deliver net zero with the needs to protect heritage, and that's a major issue looking forward. London is let's try and get this right. London is unique, dynamic and resilient. By scale, perception and difference, it is a state within a state. It's easy for those who live and work in the city to take it for granted. People outside may actively be suspicious of it and its people. When considering the future, it's necessary to avoid both complacency on the one hand or excessive pessimism on the other. Boosterism and declinism coexist closely in contemporary Britain. As the late Vivienne Westwood said, there's nowhere else like London, nothing at all, anywhere. This is surely true. The key question as London faces another crossroads moment is how to advance the city sensitively, allowing continued economic dynamism allied to improving social conditions for its citizens. Politicians who can do that will be doing the right thing for their own chances, but also the right thing for London. Thank you very much.
Well, I thought that was wonderful.
A bit long, I think. It went on a bit.
A bit long, yes. We've got so many anecdotes, haven't you? You've got so much you can throw
Other
in.
people's.
Cannot be contained. Relatedly, apart from one small correction, Walthamstow, always cool.
It's always cool, okay.
Has always been cool, always will be cool. Apart from that, I'm not going to take any more time. I'm going to put it out to the floor straight away. We have a microphone, I believe. Is the microphone knocking about somewhere over here? Take questions from our wonderful audience. Can I have a name and an affiliation alongside, ideally, a question with a question mark at the end, please? It's an academic event. You do have to make this clear. We have one down the front here.
Hello. Hi. My name's Arthur. I do public affairs at Magic Breakfast, the school breakfast provider across England and Scotland. Just here out of personal interest, though. Given that London is home to one of the most capital-intensive areas on the planet, and also has got some of the most deprived places in the UK, like Tower Hamlets, I was wondering what recommendations you suggest to make London's economy work for everyone.
Well, I mean, you could have a better property tax system, but again, we wouldn't have started from here. That could have done a lot about this. We had a fully functioning domestic property tax of the way we do have for businesses. Interesting. The business rate system is endlessly revalued, regularly revalued, and works rather well to create proper market conditions. But we've never done that. And many of the difficulty I think that the mayor and the boroughs, the GLA and the boroughs have, is that their efforts to try to bring about greater equality and to reduce inequality and reduce deprivation are in a system where national government controls so much, so many of the spending streams, policies and everything else that create the situation in the first place. So, boroughs and city halls stress and strain to get the planning system to deliver outcomes, new rail lines leading to new housing, some of it affordable by capturing, land value uplift. But that's a very, very, they're using tiny amounts of power very well to get around the broader problem of the fact that national government controls almost everything else. The council tax, 4.5% of all taxes. The other taxes national government sets 95.5%. So there's space available in this highly centralised country, and this will be true in Greater Manchester or Merseyside, just as it is here. The amount of space that the city's own government has, or the amount of power to deliver, is incredibly small, which is why I do think, and Andy Burnham's on my side, so it must be right, that devolving power would deliver better government and the kind of policies I take it you're interested in. I think people locally would have a greater chance of doing that. Now, don't get me wrong, local government sometimes gets things wrong, but all the evidence shows people trust subnational government more than MPs. Not a very high bar, but it's an old joke, but it always works. But so I think that devolution would have two effects. One is it would get better decision making of the kind I think you're looking for, and second, I think people would trust government a bit more.
We have one down at the front here.
It was a great talk. I'm Robert Leckler. I used to be in charge of the health faculties of King's, and I now co-chair a life sciences cluster in South East London. So two comments and leading on to a question. I was pleased that you drew out the fact that London needs levelling up as much as the country needs levelling up. So in a talk I used to give, I used to contrast Hull and Hampshire. You don't need to do that. There's a 10-year life expectancy difference between North and South Southwark, within almost 3 miles of each other. It's absolutely scandalous. And so I think the levelling up conversation is a little bit superficial sometimes. The other comment is that I think there's real grounds for optimism in the life sciences space, and I think London could become a biomedical capital of the world. So 10 years ago, we commissioned a study done by McKinsey's comparing London to Boston, Singapore to San Francisco. London was on a par with Boston, which is probably the paradigm of virtue in this space, in terms of publications and citations, but less than 10% of Boston in terms of commercial inward investment in life sciences. So that triggered a set of actions. And now, springing up across London, White City, the Knowledge Quarter, our own cluster called SC1, Bart's Life Sciences, Sutton and the Marsden. There are clusters springing up everywhere, and it's really, really fantastic. And I think the developers are very much on the case and very keen to see life sciences industries. So turning this into a question, are there further steps, you think, that can be taken to ensure that we realise this opportunity, which I think is a great one for economic regeneration and getting wealth into London to address some of the inequality?
Well, I think I suspect you know infinitely more about this than I do, so I'm going to be careful. But on the levelling up point first, I mean, I think seeing levelling up has been government policy partly for, dare I say it, slightly political reasons, the Red Wall and all of that, about places, not about people. Once you describe it as being about people and households, then it will apply rightly to Blackpool, but also rightly to Barking and Dagenham and Southwark. And so I think once it's people and households, not areas, and then you're away. That would be, so I think we agree on that. I mean, as I said, infinitely more about the life sciences cluster, but it is clearly something which, Camden, Hammersmith, and Fulham, other boroughs have been able to help guide. I doubt in the end it would have happened. It would have happened anyway, but rather like Shoreditch didn't become Shoreditch because government made it Shoreditch, or Silicon Roundabout. It happened because it happened. But boroughs, the mayor, have the power then to intervene and to encourage, and national government equally to make the UK attractive in terms of the tax regime. Let us keep our fingers crossed that Horizon may be back on the horizon after yesterday. So that's in a major science and medical university. So I completely agree with the logic of, and what actually is interesting to me is that things like life sciences and indeed the tech industry, as I hardly know what I'm talking about now, more generally, probably are something that could give London's economy a much more sustainable future I mean, I'm not having a go at financial and business services. We want to continue to be good at that. But, you know, and we are, the city will always be good at that. But having a balanced economy, including the city and financial services, but also these kind of sectors, looks to me like a big potential future option and a good one. And as you say, Boston and San Francisco, more complicatedly, are probably the best or the most head-to-head competitors rather than cities in Europe, I'm guessing.
Come to Alex here.
There's a lady at the front here.
Thank you very much. Alex Chan, Chair of Central District Alliance. So delighted we were able to support this evening along with our friends at North Bank. Tony, you, on the question of home or hybrid working, I think you signalled a degree of uncertainty or concern about its potential effect on productivity. Would you like to expand on that observation?
Well, first, Alex, I'd like to thank the BIDS for making this event possible. This is going to be a bit circular. I think I've heard you say at an event within Living Memory that there is a real chance that there will become a division between what people are paid, people who go into work, and those who work from home most or all of the time, partly because employers will rightly work out that those who are working from home most or all of the time are no longer having to commute and are no longer having to pay to commute. And those two gains to them are something which, if you know, we know enough about labour economics, and there are plenty of people in the room who know more about it, everybody than me, you'd expect a change to occur. It's kind of reverse London weighting, really, is what you'd expect. I think you've said to me, and I'm now repeating to you in front of other people. So I think, you know, the market will sort of sort all of this out. There are equity issues. Whenever I remember during the pandemic, I was fascinated by the fact that all the people who make buildings like this work were at work. We're all, you know, it's not true of science. Scientists tend to go into laboratories and things, but most other people could work from home. And so there are equity considerations as well between people who have to get the bus up the Walworth Road to look after this building or the ones over the road every day, and those who have choice about where they work. So I think that, as ever, the market will sort this all out. And if there are fewer people working in central London, I think over time space will be liberated, and that space will then be available for new businesses that couldn't afford to be in central London to move in. So but it might take some time to adjust. So I'm not pessimistic about the central area, but I do think, as I said twice already, government at all three levels has agency in bringing about particular outcomes.
Very good. I like the circular nature. A virtuous circle.
Virtuous.
That conversation.
Knowledge transfer.
Can we come down the front here? Exactly. Brilliant.
Hi, my name's Maureen Corcoran. I'm a London tour guide, and I'm just here, not representing anybody, just out of interest. My question, coincidentally, was also about home working. I just wondered I was thinking more the effects of home working on place. I noticed a lot of, as you say, professionals can now work from home. And I think in a way, I know in my experience, a lot of people are moving out to Brighton, to other areas, to meet the cost of housing and also have different lives and things. So it could lead to a depopulation. I also notice a bit of a growth of suburban areas. Because people are working at home, they're having coffee in their local areas, and it's regenerating high streets to an extent. So I sort of think the genie's out of the bottle. Some people won't go back to 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And I wonder what the long-term impacts of that will be on place rather than productivity.
It's a great question, and it sort of slightly goes back to my wider argument about the extraordinary growth in the southeast region or the southeast and these outside London, it's outside London's boundaries, within huge growth. I mean, to be anecdotal for a minute, I was travelling on a train from Bournemouth just before Christmas on a Friday evening, and the train was full of people getting all the way from Bournemouth via Winchester and Woking into central London. Getting on the train, who were obviously going out to the theatre or some big event at the National Gallery that evening. And of course, so great is the concentration of, on this occasion, arts and related activity, music and so on, in this central area, that people will travel a very long way in and out to access it. So even if they move to Brighton, they'll still come in to see the shows and still come in to see music and so on. Some of them will move out. They always have done. There's always been a net, almost every year back in, since statistics began, more people leave London every year than move in. People move in their 20s and 30s, or actually 18 to 30, and then they move out, and then some move back. And some people, of course, are lucky enough to be able to sustain 2 homes and do a bit of both. So I think, part of the idea I wanted to get across this evening was that, seeing London inside the boundaries of Greater London is important for those of us who are interested in London's government and economy, but actually you can't really understand that without thinking about Brighton and Milton Keynes and Southend and Reading and all of these other places, some of which are growing at incredibly fast rate. Aylesbury, anybody hear from Aylesbury, but enormous growth around Aylesbury and in Buckinghamshire as a whole. So I think that London can take a certain amount of moving out, because it's always happened. We don't quite know the effect of this yet. One of the curious consequences of Brexit is there are now fewer EU migrants and many, many more from the rest of the world. And my guess is that a disproportionate number of them will live in cities. Certainly, the evidence so far is that, for example, people coming from Hong Kong have moved into big cities, not only London, Manchester as well, just outside London a bit. So, I think London can deal with all of this churn, people moving in and out, people leaving, providing the neighbourhoods and the city centre continue to be livable and economically productive. And we don't, as I say, we don't quite yet know what the impact of COVID is going to be. But as I said, I think if some people move out permanently or 2 days a week, it'll liberate space and new businesses will move into that. Question, London may have an advantage because it has so much, I'm not an expert on this either, grade A or whatever it's called, property, which environmentally is very important because there's going to be a cut-off. Am I right? I look at planners in the room. There's a cut-off coming when very environmentally unproductive, or disastrous property will no longer be lettable. Am I right about that? I think something's changing. Somebody's nodding. And I think... and I think central London may well have an advantage in that regard because there is so much grade A or whatever it's called, top-end property in the city.
Wonderful. I'm going to do something very ambitious for the first time ever in my life, which is try and take 3 questions very quickly because we have just 5 minutes left, but I've caught 1 million people's eyes already, but I'd definitely like to go to Pat at the front here, 2nd row. Martin, this is a big challenge for you. Can I have sort of 1-sentence questions if possible, trying to get through 3 questions and then we'll do them all at once.
You meanie Jack. So Patricia Brown, I run my own consultancy, Central, but I'm going to talk about when I was running Central London Partnership. Your laundry list, Tony, of things that need attention, were also, in my mind, a laundry list of things that we attended to and have unravelled. But the thing that wasn't on that list, so I would have loved to have asked a question if Jack would have allowed about how do we actually keep forward momentum rather than go forward, backwards. But really my question is, I don't think you talked about the economy in that list. And if you think to this gentleman's, Robert's question about life sciences, if you think about what Bloomberg did under his administration in terms of innovation, tech, life sciences, investment, he really powered the future of the New York economy, and we lost in that lack of forward momentum the London Development Agency. So, economy, please.
Okay, brilliant. That was definitely a sentence. It was a long sentence. Can we go to Caroline in the orange top, just a few back? Thank you.
Hello, Caroline Pigeon from the London Assembly. Isn't it time that we had the equivalent of London Finance Commission 3, post-pandemic, looking at the case we need to make for devolution and financial reform for London, and with the potential of a new government perhaps in the next year? It seems the right time to be looking at making the case for London.
That was definitely a sentence. Thank you so much. And I'm afraid just in front here, I've caught the eye of John McTernan, I believe.
Hi, John McTernan, former director of the London Docklands Development Corporation. The LDDC had a major impact on Canary Wharf. A lot of that was the Jubilee Line extension. With the growth in the suburbs and the continued growth in population, is there a case for planning that through like a London Suburban Development Corporation that actually takes on the placemaking, the development, the rational function, and takes away from the Secretary of State the ability to stop building on London transport car parks?
Core. Okay, all that in 5 minutes. Does that seem possible? Easy.
Okay, I mean, to Pat's point, I've sort of talked about the economy elliptically, I hope, things that would make the economy work. And as you know better than me, the Mayor of New York has many more levers at their... the person in London we really need to have in the room is Jeremy Hunt and the Treasury, because they control so many of the levers that are equivalent to those that the Mayor of New York, certainly within the aegis of the state of New York, have. But you're right, the mayor and the boroughs can do better or worse, and I am slightly worried, if I'm honest, that there's a sort of anti-development mood out there. I mentioned Cockfoster's car park indirectly, which isn't good for the United Kingdom as well as isn't good for London. And so I do think that simply everybody saying we can't have anything near me and nothing can ever develop anywhere isn't going to be very good for rents for young people, the economy, the world, and anything. So I take your point. It's a great one. LFC3, well, the Liberal Democrats, of course, famously have been in favour of local income tax for a number of years, which the Finance Commission did sort of, we had to keep it was a coalition, the Finance Commission. So personally, I think Scotland and Wales have, tax autonomy, including local income tax. I think the deal struck, the Windsor deal, includes elements of VAT variation in Northern Ireland, unless I misheard it. So I do think that the beginning, mustn't prejudge it. Were there to be a change of government, or frankly, if the present government got back and felt re-empowered, the opportunities created by, having major political parties run by people who have a grip and who are confident enough after winning a general election to try something new, like devolution, which would be good for them. So LFC3 for sure. Jeremy and I have been plotting an event to celebrate 10 years of, Jeremy Skinner here, of the London Finance Commissioner later this summer. And then last but not least, John. I think there was a mayor called Boris Johnson before Sadiq Khan and after Ken Livingstone, and he, I think, had an Outer London Commission, which, did, in fairness to Boris, recognise the reality that it's very easy, and we're all guilty of it, because central and inner London are a sort of common version, an understood version of London, which people who've never visited Britain can understand, even. So there is a risk that the outer boroughs get less attention. But I would say, as I hinted, what's going on in all the boroughs, the capacity for self-action in the boroughs has led to remarkable changes in many of those boroughs in recent years. Now, I doubt the boroughs themselves would be over the moon about a development corporation that took away their powers in the way the LDDC did. But I do absolutely take your point that something that thought about the different needs of different parts of outer London, some of which do want lots of development, and the council wants it, and others don't. Some sort of way of thinking that through rationally, great idea, so I agree with that too.
Brilliantly
Canary
done.
Wharf turned out well in the end, as I'd also say.
Really sorry to those who had hands up towards the end there and I didn't quite get round to, but we do have a drink for you all, courtesy of our wonderful sponsors, North Bank Bid and Central District Alliance. So perhaps we can continue the conversation there. All it remains for me to do is to thank very much, that was wonderful, thank you, Professor Tony Travers.
Just before we're all switched off, unusually, this was a written lecture, which probably meant it wasn't quite as well delivered as normally, or even worse if you look at it in other ways. But so if anybody'd like a copy, I will let Kings have a copy, so it can, with the pictures, some of which I forgot to use. So if you'd like to get a written version of it, there is one. That's all I'd say.
And if you'd like to get a drink, they're at the back.